Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is entrepreneur and around-the-world pilot Jack Long. He tells us about long-distance flights, single-pilot IFR habits, and flying for conservation. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hi pilots, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our archives, where you can listen to all 100 plus episodes. Also, if you haven't heard our newest podcast yet, make sure to check out the Airfax podcast, the story behind the story. Every month, Airfax managing editor Eric Radke interviews a fascinating pilot to learn about the people behind the incredible stories we publish. The first episode is out now, and it is a great one. You can listen at airfaxjournal.com/podcast. Today, I'm excited to have Jack Long on the podcast, who I've known for at least a decade. He's a serial entrepreneur, but he's also one of the most thoughtful and disciplined pilots I've ever met. He has flown his Pilatus PC-12 around the world, both eastbound and westbound, over both the North and South Poles, and done 24 Atlantic crossings. He is the former president of the Pilatus Owners and Pilots Association, and just an all-around interesting guy. Jack, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Well, thank you for having me, John. It'll be great to catch up with you.
You've done some incredible flights, the poles, around the world, and you've done it all in an unmodified standard category airplane. Now, granted, the Pilatus PC-12 is a very capable airplane, but there are no ferry tanks involved here. It's just you and your airplane and some friends flying around the world. So why did you decide to start doing these in the first place? What's the payoff?
First, thanks for mentioning this as a totally stock aircraft, because I always worry people get the impression that I'm some kind of, daredevil pilot doing high-risk things. These flights, we can talk about more later, but as far as the airplane's concerned, it's a totally normal flight, operated all within the normal operating limitations. I don't consider them any riskier than my normal domestic flying. But as to why I do it, it's a combination of things. I think all humans have sort of urge to explore. I think that's just innate in human beings. And mine may be just a little bit stronger than most people. And I was a child of the Apollo generation, so seeing the astronauts land on the first steps on the moon, of course, that was the ultimate exploration. That's super exciting to me. Being an astronaut was not in my future. The round the world flying, the international flying, the oceanic crossings is a combination of that satisfying that exploration instinct, doing something unusual, going to some places where in some cases people don't go often, or at least I haven't been often, combined with my passion for aviation and flying. And just the art of flying, the science of flying. And it's just, for me, sort of magical. We were flying from the Svalbard, which is about 400 miles north of the mainland of Norway, a group of islands, to Greenland. Me and a pilot friend of mine and my wife and my daughter were in the back. And we took off from Svalbard, very unusual place, very unusual airport. And we're on the HF radio talking to Bodo Oceanic. And as we were climbing out, we just both me and my pilot friend, almost simultaneously looked at each other and just said, "Isn't this the coolest thing in the world?" We just, both of us had that emotion of how lucky we are to be able to do this. And so that's combining exploration, seeing new places, the actual flying of the aircraft. Like I said, I do a totally stock aircraft, so the takeoff and landings and all that, there's nothing particularly challenging about that. But the planning and the logistics, learning a little bit about different procedures and different countries and different oceanic airspaces, that's all super interesting to me.
Well, so tell me about that planning, because as you mentioned, the flying in some ways is the easy part. The planning has got to be a whole lot more than just open up ForeFlight and look at some airports. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, it is quite a bit of work. Now, you can hire companies that will do it all for you. And there's also companies that cater to GA pilots like you and me, and will do guided trips, including around the world trips, where they do all the planning and everything, and you just fly the airplane and follow their instructions. And then there's other companies that cater more to BizJet type folks who really act like a dispatcher in an airline, where, if you're a corporate pilot flying a Gulfstream, you're not getting overflight permits and landing permits and arranging ground transportation, all that. You've got a staff that does that for you, and you just show up at the airplane, get a pamphlet, and it's got everything laid out for you, including your flight plan already filed and all that. I really enjoy the flying part of the planning. I don't enjoy the permits. And so we've typically hired a company, in our case, a company called Universal Aviation, to handle all the permitting and also coordinate ground handling when we get to the airport. They run airplanes, dozens of airplanes through most of these airports we went to, with a few exceptions. So they know who the good ground handlers are and the not so good ground handlers. And also all the bills go to Universal. Universal pays all the bills, and you get billed after the fact. So that helps things, makes things easier on the ground. But I love the flight planning. And so it starts with picking a route, obviously. And my wife says, and she's sort of right, I sort of take the maximum range of the PC-12 and pick airport pairs that fit the range of the aircraft. And that's true to a certain extent. We typically, our philosophy on these trips is, if we're going to get up and go flying, we're going to, make it a full day. And it also reduces every stop involves, usually several $1,000s of fees. And so, making long legs makes a lot of sense from a lot of perspectives. So picking a route out, we did our first round the world trip eastbound in 2015. And my wife said, "Oh, well, good, Jack, scratch that itch, check that off his list." And it just gave me the bug to do it even more. So we discovered, I say I do all these with other pilot friends. It's never just me in the cockpit for the round the world trips. And we discovered no one had ever done a polar around the world trip that had been sort of recognized by FAI, which is an organization that recognizes all sorts of aviation, achievements. There's been lots of GA pilots that had flown a polar around the world trip. They just never bothered to do the paperwork to get it recognized. So we said, let's do that. And so the second round the world trip was polar, which technically you don't have to fly under the FAI rules directly over the North and South Pole. You have to fly to point 75 north and 75 south. And so we did that. We planned that flight. And so obviously that's a whole different set of airports you're going to. We crossed the South Atlantic instead of the North Atlantic. But anyway, and then finally we did a westbound around the world trip, since we hadn't done that. And so the route's the first thing. And then we're normally, airports, what services are available. Normally, since we're entering a new country, almost every flight, we're going to an international airport where they have pretty good services. But in some cases, we've had to make technical stops. They call it fuel stops at smaller airports where there isn't a lot of support. And in a couple of cases, we've had to have drums of fuel delivered, especially for us, and fuel out of drums. And then the permitting, what's sort of decided on the airports. I've done the flight planning, pro forma flight planning. Thank goodness ForeFlight and many other flight planning packages now have historical average winds and temperatures. So you can do a pretty good job of understanding what the range is and how much reserve you'll have. Then comes the permits, which I say we farm that out, generally speaking. Antarctica, we landed in Antarctica, and that was something that Universal Aviation never planned to fly to Antarctica. So we were sort of on our own for doing that. So that was a special case where we had to do a lot of permitting work on our own. But the idea is, if we've done our planning right and got the permits in line, once we launch, it should be pretty easy. And so far, so good. people sometimes, well, what's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you on one of these trips or something like that? And my wife says, when people ask her that, she says, Jack doesn't do scary. And we really never had a major mechanical issue or a delay, significant delay. It's, if you do the planning right, it all goes smoothly.
Yeah, it's inspirational for, I think, me, and I think a lot of people to dream a little bigger. And so I wonder, how has this changed your view of the world or any country in particular, or the power of airplanes? I mean, beyond the technical flying part, how has it changed how you think about things?
Yeah, we had traveled quite a bit, on commercial airlines before this. We've been landed in 45 countries in our aircraft, so we've been to a lot of countries we hadn't been to before. But it, certainly gives you an appreciation for cultures that you haven't been in contact with before. The view from the air is incredible. Flying over the Andes, and you think flying at flight level 270 is pretty high. You cross the Andes, you're at 5,000 or 6,000 AGL, and Antarctica, of course, flying over Antarctica is just. I often tell people that's probably as close to going to the moon as I'll ever get. Just a completely foreign landscape, and so the views and the cultural experiences, and sometimes the aviation aspects sort of blends into that, because when we get to an airport, we spend some time with the ground handlers or going through customs, and they usually take us to our hotel, and so we spend some time with sort of normal folks that are not tourist oriented, and so it's been great, but I do it mainly for the flying. I mean, that's, if I just wanted to experience new views and cultural experiences and I didn't care about the flying, well, you can, with the exception of Antarctica and the North Pole flight and a couple of weird places we've been, you could visit those places via commercial airlines.
And how do you handle passengers? Because as you mentioned, you usually travel with a group. This is not you as a solo pilot out there. What do they go through in terms of training, or how do you brief them? How do you approach it for non-flying passengers?
Yeah, so to give you context, there's one couple, Josh and Becky, who have done every leg of all 3 round-the-world trips with us. And Josh is the pilot, Becky's not. But Becky and my wife, Carolyn, are very good friends. And this will tie into the second part of our conversation. Josh is on the board of LightHawk, and that's how I met him. And but so Josh and I, and then there's 2 other pilots that have been on pieces of this trip. But it's generally the pilots and their spouses. Carolyn, my spouse, and Becky, Josh's spouse, have done every leg except the Antarctic flight. They didn't go on the Antarctic. They went on that whole trip except for the Antarctic flights. So as far as training, Carolyn and I did the so-called Dunker course. I think it's called formerly Aircraft Water Evacuation Course, which a lot of people that fly helicopters out to and from oil rigs, not only the pilots, but the crew, the people they're taking out have to do it. So it's probably don't have time to go into the details of that, but it involves a classroom segment, and then you go to a swimming pool where they've got a faux airplane and a raft. And so you actually get to inflate a raft and a emergency raft. They turn it over upside down, so you get experience riding it to right side up in the pool. And then they put you in this little fake airplane and turn the airplane upside down and sink it rapidly, sink it slowly, and you have to get out. And of course, they have safety divers in the pool if you struggle. So Carolyn and I did that. Josh and Becky had done that previously in preparation for a sailing trip. And then as far as training, we brief, if we're flying over cold water, we take the immersion suits. And I don't make the passengers wear the immersion suits, the so-called Gumby suits, for the entire flight. They can if they want to, but no one's taking me up on that. But I do require they demonstrate that they can don the suit in less than 2 minutes in the airplane unassisted. So either on the ground or on a first flight leg where we're over land, Carolyn will usually sort of coach them on how to get these suits on efficiently. And then I'll just brief them on the life raft. Here's where it's connected. You need to keep this line connected to the aircraft. Here's how you inflate it. Here's the emergency, your first choice emergency exit is the over wing exit. Second choice is the main cabin entrance. So, maybe a 15-minute type briefing like that. But other than that, the passengers treat it pretty much like a normal flight.
So I think one of the reasons, reading between the lines, you've been so successful at this is your approach to flying is very disciplined. And I've seen this. You've presented at POPA conferences over the years. You're very serious about safety. And in particular, I think you have some personal standard operating procedures that would rival a lot of 135 operators. So tell us how you develop those and maybe give us an example of one of those.
Sure. So when I got the PC-12 in 2008, of course, insurance required mentor flying time, which I think is great. And my mentor pilot, I did some hours with a PC-12 specialist, someone who specialized, John Morse, who I think you've flown with quite a bit. I did about 25 hours with him, but then insurance wanted, and I think it's perfectly reasonable, another 75 hours with not necessarily a PC-12 specialist, but a really experienced, turbine jet pilot. And so I located a pilot here at my home base in Austin, Texas, and he had flown 135 practically his whole career, and he was just adamant about SOPs and operating manuals. And he just simply said, Jack, do you want to have the same level of safety as 135 and 121 operations? And he briefly covered the data, on how accident rates on Part 91 are multiples of 135 and 121. And I said, well, sure, I want that. Well, then you need to act like a 135 or 121 organization. And frankly, before that, I was probably a typical GA pilot. I didn't have operating manuals or any of that stuff. And I figured, well, if the FAA says I'm safe, with this type of training, that's good enough for me. And he just totally, and we spent 75 hours in the cockpit, so he had plenty of time to beat it in my head. But I totally bought off on it. And so he helped me find a template for an operating manual. Some people will call them standard operating procedures, but I call it operating manual. A template it was originally designed for Part 135 operation. And he helped me sort of go through it and develop a first draft of that manual. And then after I stopped flying with him, I think I'm on revision 15 of this manual now. Mainly I will encounter a situation that isn't covered in the manual, and I have to make sort of a judgment call on the moment. And the whole idea of these manuals is to minimize the number of judgment calls you have to make when you're under pressure, when you've got passengers, waiting to go. And so I've added to the manual, as I started doing international flying, I added sections related to the international flying. And so, and I follow it strictly. I don't think I've cheated on those standards once. Now, my mentor pilot, he pointed out, sometimes when you draft these manuals, you think, okay, I want to be safe. So you make, the requirements really, really, really tight. And he said, there's a trade-off there. If you make them super tight, then you're going to be more tempted to cheat on them. And so he sort of helped me, okay, these are minimums. So if there's a given situation where the manual says you can do it, but you're not comfortable, of course, you can choose not to do it. But don't make the standards so tight that you're going to be tempted to cheat on it. And so I use that manual religiously. I train at flight safety twice a year, normal, recurrent, 3 or 4 days. And then halfway in between recurrence, I go back for 1 day instrument proficiency check. And they also do unusual attitudes and steep turns, and they'll throw in a couple of emergencies. So training twice a year. Again, that's just mimicking what 135 does. And you and I gave a presentation on this, and I made the point that some GA pilots will say, I don't want all those constraints and everything. GA flying's about freedom, and this is restricting my freedom. To me, it makes the flying easier because there are fewer judgment calls where you're, oh, should I do this or should I not? There's still some, of course, mainly related to convective weather. You can't write a rule book about that very well. But to me, it's just, oh, is the weather good enough or not? Look in the book. Oh, yeah, it's good enough, or, oh, it's not. We can't go. And so to me, it takes some stress out of the flying, in addition to, I think, improving overall safety.
It's such a good model, I think, for new pilots to follow. I, like you, probably often talk to somebody who wants to either learn to fly or upgrade their airplane and start using the airplane for real transportation. Maybe they want to fly a Cirrus and they want to start really doing cross-country IFR. They want to step up to a TBM or a Pilatus or a Citation. And I sometimes see people who are interested in that lifestyle, but have not really bought into that safety mindset, like you mentioned. So it's certainly, I think, the right way to approach it, because you're right. It's more fun and it's easier if you think about these decisions in an air-conditioned room at 1G and 0 knots than when you're trucking along at night and have to make a tough decision. So you're absolutely right. Jack, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, let's switch and talk about that conservation flying. Hey pilots, let's be honest. Once you pass your check ride, flying isn't just about checklists and maneuvers. It's about making smart decisions and adjusting when things don't go as planned. That's where VFR and IFR Mastery from Pilot Workshops come in. Every month, you'll get brand new flying scenarios, one for VFR pilots and one for IFR pilots, designed to challenge your decision-making skills in a safe, risk-free environment. Led by Pilot Workshops' award-winning team of flight instructors, these scenarios focus on practical flying tips and real-world strategies that make you a more confident, more prepared pilot. Whether it's handling tricky weather, navigating unexpected airspace issues, or making tough go, no-go calls, Mastery helps sharpen the skills you actually use in the cockpit. It's more than just reading an article or watching a video. It's a multi-step, interactive experience that even includes a community section where you can talk with other pilots about their decision-making process. I've been a panelist for Mastery, and I can tell you it's one of the most educational and fun experiences of my aviation career. So I invite you to join thousands of other pilots who rely on these expert insights to stay sharp. Sign up for a free trial of VFR or IFR Mastery today at PilotWorkshops.com and take your flying to the next level. That's PilotWorkshops.com. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion. We are back with Jack Long, who has done a lot of flying for organizations like LightHawk, which bills itself as a, quote, unique blend of conservation and aviation. So, Jack, for someone who has never done it, what is conservation flying all about?
So conservation flying, and what LightHawk does, if probably more pilots have done angel flights. And so I'll start with that analogy. So angel flight organization identifies people that need transportation for medical procedures, sort of screens them, makes sure the need is legitimate, and then organizes flights and posts them for volunteer pilots. It's say, yeah, I'd take that flight, and you go do the flight. So Angel Flight is sort of the middleman that organizes those flights. LightHawk, it's a pretty analogous situation, except that their partners, or the equivalent of the patients in the Angel Flight, are conservation organizations. Some people call them environmental organizations. So organizations that need airlift for a variety of different purposes. And LightHawk is the middleman that screens the partners, they call them, to make sure the need is, legitimate, and, they don't want to ask pilots to do flights that are just, $100 hamburger run for fun. They need to be meaty flights that have a real conservation purpose to them. So they screen the flights and then match pilots willing to volunteer their time up with those organizations. And throughout the flight, this is where it's a little different than Angel Flight. Angel Flight, once they sort of pair you up with your patient, they sort of step out of it. LightHawk is very involved all the way through, from the matching you up with the conservation organization to the flight and post-flight. So they're involved in the coordination all along the way, usually. And so conservation organizations, it runs a variety. some of the flights they do are in high wing Cessnas where they want to take sort of VIP types, elected officials and other folks out and give them they call it an aerial epiphany, an aerial view of an area that's either been conserved and is doing great, or an area that's being degraded and needs conservation, or sometimes the two together. Here's an area, here's what can happen, and here's what's happening. But for me, the PC-12 is best for what they call wildlife transport flights because of the big cargo door and the big cabin. And those are nearly always either endangered animals that have been raised in captivity, very endangered animals. Sometimes just a few hundred of these animals exist in the world. And so they're trying to increase the population by breeding them in captivity. And in order to keep the DNA pool diverse, they need to move those animals around from one captive breeding facility to another. So that's probably the majority of the flights I've done have been of that nature. In some cases, it's taking animals from captivity and releasing them into the wild, which that's fun because that's the ultimate objective. And then we may or may not have time to talk about it, but most recently, I was involved in a series of flights to facilitate the reintroduction of gray wolves to Colorado. The wolves had been exterminated basically in the early 1900s in Colorado, and the voters passed a law to reintroduce wolves. And so that was a little different because the wolf is not rare in many parts of North America, but it is rare in Colorado. And so those are type of flights I do. Most of them are domestic. I think I've done 6 or 7 international flights, 2 to Belize, 1 to Mexico, and now 5 to Canada. But most of them are from one point to another in the U.S. So again, the flying's not unusual or risky or anything, but it's just really interesting to meet the veterinarians and the wildlife biologists. And my main job is just to be the bus driver, just to fly the plane. But I always like picking their brains about, okay, what are you doing with these animals? Why did they become so rare in the first place? What's the program to, reintroduce them and get the population up? So it's really interesting. And conservation outside of aviation, conservation is probably equivalent passion for me and my wife. We volunteer for several conservation organizations, one called the Nature Conservancy in particular, and philanthropically support these organizations. So that overlay of conservation and aviation is just a perfect fit for me.
Yeah, the story about transporting those gray wolves from Canada to Colorado is fascinating. We'll link to that in the show notes because there's some pictures of those being unloaded from the back of your airplane. As you said, great trip for the PC-12. What do you think about on a flight like that? I mean, I would guess there's some of the same mentality of planning an Atlantic crossing, maybe not as long a flight, but what are you thinking about in terms of planning it, weight and balance, briefing? Do you fly it any differently, or is it just a regular old flight?
Yeah, it depends. Some of the flights, it's not a lot of weight. I've flown 10 different species of animals at this point, including 3 wolf species. And the Mexican gray wolf, which I've probably done 15 flights with Mexican gray wolves, and red wolf, which I've only done 1. Those are sort of smaller animals. They're more like domestic dog size. And so you've got maybe 3 animals and dog crates. They weigh maybe 100 pounds, 150 pounds. So it's not a big weight imbalance issue. And we normally just take the 2 back seats out, which a lot of PC-12 owners operate that way anyway, or at least with one of the seats out. So it's a pretty minor reconfiguration of the cabin. Now, this gray wolf flight from Canada to Colorado, these animals are much bigger, and we wanted to carry 5 at a time. And so we removed essentially the entire passenger interior from the airplane because we selected crates that were we had about an inch of clearance on all sides to get 5 crates in. And in that case, weight and balance became, one, we had to do a much more significant reconfiguration of the cabin than normal. And weight and balance, we had to be careful about that. And because we'd removed the interior, it wasn't a standard weight and balance calculation. We sort of had to measure where the centers of the crate were along the axis of the airplane and come up with sort of a new weight and balance worksheet. So that took a bit of work. And those flights, the wintertime operations, for some folks, that's pretty normal. But for me, operating in very cold and snowy environments is not something I do regularly. And so just think about de-icing the airplane and getting the airplane started. And when it's cold soaked down to -20 centigrade and things like that was an issue. But most of the flights are pretty routine. People will ask, "Oh, you've got those wild animals in the back. Aren't you worried about them, attacking you?" And they're in these they're in a crate. They can't get out. So I don't worry about that at all. And they don't make a lot of noise. They don't thrash around. The veterinarians say they're actually very stressed being in those crates. And they're, thankfully, wolves anyway, their reaction to stress is to sort of hunker down. And so, I nearly always have a handler with us in case something came up in flight. So normally, other than these Colorado wolf flights, is the flying part of it's normally pretty standard.
And if I want to get involved in this, I don't have to have a fancy airplane, right? You mentioned, high-wing Cessnas. I assume I don't have to have 5,000 hours in an ATP. I mean, if I've just got a Cessna 182 and I want to get involved, is that doable?
Oh, yeah. I don't know specifically, but I would think the majority of the flights they organize are in light, 4-seat piston engine aircraft, typically high-wing, because those flights are often either photography flights or sort of sightseeing aerial epiphany flights with VIP types. So that's probably the majority of their flights. And their requirements, I think, for time are maybe a little bit higher than Angel flight, but it's not crazy. I mean, private pilot license, Cessna 172 is fine. And you go through an orientation. It's a, online virtual orientation, or at least it was when I did it. I think it still is. So it's not like you got to go do a check ride with a LightHawk pilot. As far as I know, you don't. Anyone can get involved. They have need for a variety of different aircraft types.
Okay, Jack, we always end Pilot's Discretion with our Ready to Copy segment. I'll throw out some rapid fire questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
I'm ready.
What's the craziest thing you've ever transported in your airplane? Can you top those wolves?
California condors.
That's a good one. You mentioned you've landed at airports all over the world. What's the most interesting one you've ever been to?
It's called Marsh Airfield in Antarctica. It's on the Antarctic Peninsula, sort of about 800 miles south of mainland South America.
And what did you have to...
Gravel airstrip, run by the military, but it actually has a civilian control, Chilean military, but it actually has a civilian control tower.
And how do I get fuel in Antarctica?
Well, not easily. There is an airline, believe it or not, that operates BAE 146 jet aircraft, the high wing jets with 4 engines. In the summer season, Antarctic summer season, from Punta Arenas, Chile, on the southern tip of South America, to this Marsh Airfield. And it's a tourist flight. You can go down and just spend a few hours, or you can go down and join your cruise ship there instead of crossing the Drake Passage in a ship. And they, at the beginning of the season, take barrels of fuel in barrels down there for their own operations. So we contacted them, and they did their calculations, and they said, okay, we think we have enough extra fuel that we can sell you a couple barrels. And my standard joke is, if the plane would have run off a fine Cabernet wine, it would have been cheaper than that fuel. but we got it. So that's how you do it.
All right. In 10 words or less, can you describe what it was like to see the Northern Lights from Iceland?
Sublime. one word for you.
One word. Perfect. And where did you fly to get to those northern lights?
We had this was very different than most of my other flights, where it's very tightly planned, and I know exactly where we're going to be on this day. For this flight, this I call Aurora chasing flight, we had a whole string of airports from central Canada over to Norway that we, depending on weather conditions, would have gone to. We ended up going to Reykjavik, Iceland, and coolest part of that trip was we stopped at Bluey West 1, which is Narsarsuaq, which is unfortunately it's an iconic airport, and it's going to be closed down next year. But that was the coolest aviation part. But we went to Reykjavik and saw the Northern Lights there, outside of Reykjavik.
What is one thing you've learned about yourself during all of these world travels?
I'm a very detail-oriented person, and I have to be careful to not get so down in the weeds that I lose the big picture. So, and that's one of the values of having the other pilots with me. They'll sometimes, tell me, okay, let's pull back and, look at the big picture here for a while. And that's very valuable for me.
What is your favorite piece of survival gear for these long distance flights?
It is a dry suit, immersion suit called a U-Zip-It suit. And why? So as I mentioned earlier, I don't require passengers to wear those Gumby suits, but I do wear for flying over cold water. I don't wear for flying over warm water, but for flying over cold water, I wear this. It's called a constant wear suit, and it's designed. And the reason I wear it is the theory is if there's an emergency, I can't go in the back and, spend 2 minutes putting on a Gumby suit. I need to be able to stay at the controls and get the emergency suit donned quickly. And so this suit is designed, one, that it's comfortable because it's designed for sort of like Coast Guard folks that operate on helicopters. So they wear it all day. It's part of their standard kit. And it's also designed that you can don it up to your waist and then roll up the upper part, put it in your lap. And then in less than 1 minute, you can pull the upper part over your head. And it's got this zipper with a big long string or leather strap on it. And you can zip it up yourself. So that allows me to have the emergency suit on, but still be really comfortable.
What is something you did differently on your second round the world flight? Maybe something you learned from your first trip that you did differently?
Well, the second one was the polar trip. So we had to, as I mentioned earlier, do a lot of permitting work for Antarctica ourselves. So that was different because it had to be different. But honestly, as far as flight operations, we did it about the same way.
Do you have any specific rules or personal minimums for single pilot flying? Duty day limits or runway lengths or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. I've got, as we discussed earlier, I've got about a 20-page manual full of those. So, yeah, it covers duty times, rest periods, crosswind components, runway lengths, fuel reserves. Maybe it covers all the stuff a typical Part 135 manual would cover. And so, yeah, as we discussed, you can't have a rule for everything in flying. There's always going to be some judgment calls that remain, but my objective is to minimize the number of judgment calls. And this manual covers a great deal of those.
What is the best thing about the Pilatus PC-12?
Oh, gosh, that's like saying which of your children is your favorite. So, as you know, we're both big PC-12 fans, and I'm a fanboy as well. I think the range and the cabin size. I mean, it really, for passenger, some people say, well, other aircraft, TBN, they're more of a pilot's airplane. They're faster and lighter on the controls, and then that's true. But I enjoy doing these flights with other people, and it really has an airline feel in the back. I mean, my wife, when we owned the Cirrus, she would sort of grudgingly, we'd go fly places, but given the choice, she would probably have always preferred to go commercial. That's totally changed. She much prefers the PC-12, and she feels like it's more comfortable than your typical business class airline seat. And then the range, a lot of these trips we've done, we just couldn't do it in a shorter range airplane. They just would have been impossible. So the range of the PC-12 opens up a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, the range really is incredible. I know when I stepped up into that out of a Cheyenne, I didn't even think about doing a 4-hour trip. That wasn't even on the menu ever. And 4-hour trips in PC-12s are nothing. You don't think twice about it. That's just another Tuesday morning.
Yeah, we've done several over 8-hour flights at long-range cruise power.
You've had a very successful business career in addition to all your flying. So what's a flying habit that serves you well in the boardroom?
I'm going to answer that in the opposite way. There's so many things about being an entrepreneur that can be very dangerous in an airplane. And so part of the challenge I had initially was transferring from my entrepreneur mindset where you need to take risks. You need to say, okay, I'm not sure this is going to work, but the odds look pretty good. So let's try it. And if it doesn't work, oh, well, we lost some money. Boy, you transfer that mindset into that airplane and you're not probably going to be walking on this world very long. So it was not so much transferred. I guess the planning part, I was always, as an entrepreneur, more on the operations and finance side of the business, where you had to do a lot of planning and a lot of math. And so I think that translated well, but there was a lot more that does not translate well, and you have to be aware of that.
That's a very good point. Jack, I know you spent a lot of time over the years you have in the Jackson Hole area, beautiful part of America. Where's the best place to go for a hike in that area? Where's a hidden gem next time I'm out there I need to check out?
My wife and I, we love a hike that's called Granite Canyon. It's on the south part of the park. And you can walk up and it's very nice, have lunch next to a big roaring creek. And it's sheltered from the sun most of the day. For a pilot, though, there is a butte. It's called Blacktail Butte. It's just to the northeast of runway 19 at the Jackson Hole Airport. And I think it's 1,400 or 1,500 feet high. And so if you hike up Blacktail Butte, you can actually watch the planes in the pattern below you. And so from a pilot's, and it's a nice hike, probably not as nice as the Granite Creek hike, but it's really cool to be able to watch the airplanes come and go from the Jackson Hole Airport.
Yeah, that and Palm Springs, California, to me are the two places where without too much work, you can be above the airport and watch the operations from the world's tallest control tower. It's pretty neat view.
That is cool.
All right, Jack, our last question is always the same on Pilot's Discretion. You have one final flight and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
So tomorrow we are taking our 2004 PC-12 flying from Austin, Texas to St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. Spend 3 or 4 days there with friends. And then this is a sort of a different flight from St. Croix up to Bermuda, just almost due north up to Bermuda. And my wife and I are celebrating our 40th anniversary next week. And we're staying at not only the same place we stayed in for our honeymoon, but the exact same cabin that we stayed in 40 years ago. So, and then Bermuda back to Austin, obviously with a stop to clear customs. So an oceanic flight, but it's an oceanic flight where we don't actually cross the ocean. We just sort of go halfway across and come back. But we're really looking forward to that.
Jack, thanks for being on the podcast.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.